Thank you for agreeing to be part of this research project as part of the doctoral dissertation titled Social Inclusion and Participation in the Design of the Post-2015 Agenda, now known as Agenda 2030, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Your role and experience in this process will provide significant input about the level of social inclusion of this development process. Welcome, Elliot.
Thank you very much, Juan. Glad to be here.
So if you can tell us your name and affiliation.
My name is Elliot Harris. I'm the Assistant Secretary General for UNEP, the Director of UNEP's New York office, and Head of the Secretariat of the Environment Management Group of the United Nations.
Thank you so much. So to begin, in your opinion, what is the value or importance of social inclusion and participation during the design of the post-2015 development agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals?
I see the importance in two areas, and the first is that this was designed to be an inclusive agenda, an agenda for all. It's a universal agenda. And so having the participation of social groups, having the participation of civil society, academics, other institutional stakeholders, and private individuals was a really important way of getting a clear understanding of what the priorities are going forward. That too contributes to the second aspect, which is that this agenda is actually for people. It's about people and prosperity in the planet, and consequently, for it to work, for it to succeed, it has to be taken on board by people, supported by people, actually implemented by the people it's intended to benefit. And so having the participation at the design phase is really important to getting people to understand what the agenda is about, how it benefits them, and to get their buy-in, which is going to be critical for successful implementation down the road.
Thank you. So how do you think social participation influenced the post-2015 process, and what mechanisms do you think were most important?
I think I would suggest, if I could answer it in the reverse order, the most important mechanism was the way in which the post-2015 design took place, which was through the open working group process. Now that is a significant departure from the way the UN normally does these kinds of major outcome documents, major negotiations. It was a really open process. It brought in the stakeholders from all sorts of different walks of life, from different ministries in the member state governments, from academia, from the civil society organizations. And it allowed them to participate, making their views known, allowing them to express their concerns, and allowing them to identify their priorities. Without any doubt at all, that influenced the way in which the agenda came together. Now, the consequence of that is, of course, that we have an agenda that is much more complex than it might otherwise have been, but that complexity reflects the very complexity of the subject matter itself. We're talking about the way in which we live in this planet in the future, and it's not a simple and straightforward matter. But I think what is really key here is that in this process of the open working group mechanism, everyone was entitled to bring in their views, and they did. Now, the consequence of that is, as I say, we have a more complex agenda, but it is also an agenda that is realistic. It is not something that was designed at a distance from reality, but it reflects the reality on the ground. It reflects the priorities that people feel out there. And I think this is really important. This is what is going to make the agenda different to anything that preceded it before.
Great. So do you think that the design of the agenda itself was an inclusive process? I guess from what you're pointing, it was. But so what evidence is there of this?
I think the best evidence that this was an inclusive process is how difficult it was to get into the negotiating rooms because it was so full. In every single session, every seat in the negotiating hall was taken. Every seat that was assigned to civil society, to the stakeholder community, was taken. There were never any gaps in the room, and people were present. The demand for access was huge. And the only reason there would have been that demand is that people realized that for the first time they were actually being asked their opinion. They were actually getting an opportunity to put their views on the table and to influence a design process at the design phase and not afterwards.
So how familiar are you with the results of the My World survey, the UN system-wide consultations, civil society self-organized consultations, the UN Global Pulse big data tools, and how have you participated, interacted, designed, or implemented any of these instruments, and were these results transparent and accessible in your opinion?
Well, that's a long and complex question. I'm afraid the answer to most facets of that question is that I was not very much involved. I was aware that these surveys were going on, but I was not involved in designing them or in implementing them or in collating the results. That said, throughout the period, as the results were coming in, they were brought into circulation within the UN task team, which was the interagency group that was helping to support the member states in the design of the Sustainable Development Goals. And where relevant, the conclusions or the results of these surveys were put on the table as illustrations of the types of issues that the stakeholders were finding important and the things that they wanted to see reflected. So I was aware that they were going on, but I wasn't familiar with the details, nor was I at all involved in their actual execution.
Do you think the results of the aforementioned tools were useful or easy to make sense of?
I think they were. As I said, we did receive periodic updates of what was going on in these surveys and of the preliminary results because they were put on the table by the participating agencies in the course of the discussions that we had within the interagency task team that was providing technical support to the member states in the negotiations process. What that helped us to understand was A, the degree of interest among the different stakeholders out there. People were clearly following the process very closely. And B, it signaled to us that some of the things that we might not have emphasized as much, or some of the things that for political reasons of expediency might not have been front center, such as Goal 16, that these were things that were very, very important to the stakeholders outside, the governance issues, for example. And that gave us the ability and the confidence to represent these issues much more forcefully within the negotiating phase here among the member states.
So in your view, were these results presented in a timely manner to policymakers? Did they have any impact on the actual design of the agenda? Do you think that the SDG proposal, in and of itself, the outcome document, is inclusive because of this?
I won't say it's inclusive just because of the surveys, of My World and so on. I think those were very important contributing factors. I think those surveys may have enabled many stakeholders to make their views known who would not otherwise have been able to come physically to New York and speak, who were not members in the various NGOs or civil society organizations that were actually seated at the table. So it was far more inclusive in terms of a process in that way. I think it did have an influence on how the overall outcome was arrived at, because it was very clear that this was an issue, this whole question of the Sustainable Development Agenda was an issue of importance to a much broader range of people than anybody had suspected at the outset. And so as the results started coming in, there was great interest in finding out, well, what is it that people really want from this agenda? And how do they prioritize it? That did help us to winnow down. There were many, many suggestions on the table. But the preliminary results of the My World Survey were among the factors that helped us to decide, well, what are the core priorities that humanity is facing? What are the things that are most important to people out there, right? So one concrete example is that for as much as we had made progress under the MDG agenda in reducing poverty, it was still clearly seen as an unresolved issue. It is an unfinished agenda. And so in this new Sustainable Development Agenda, poverty is front and center still. And a large part of that was because of the feedback that we got from stakeholders. Look, this was still an issue.
Do you personally feel represented during do you feel that you were represented during the SDG design process as an individual? I mean, and what could have been done or improved in terms of social participation during the design process of the post-2015 agenda and the SDGs?
As an individual, it's hard for me to say that. I mean, I was involved in all kinds of different official aspects of this whole preparation. I did feel that some of the issues that were important to me as a person were put on the table during the negotiations. I think they were put on the table by all sorts of different stakeholders, including the governments. I think the governments were quite well attuned to what was needed. And when I say governments, I mean people coming from capital, people who actually make policy and implement policy, which is not necessarily what you see happening in New York. The usual discussions are among foreign affairs people, and those are very different to the ones who do policy back home in governments. But I thought that most of the issues that I had found critical and that I would think are important to succeeding with this new agenda were indeed on the table and were being discussed fruitfully. As I say, I was not involved personally in the My World survey or any of the other types of surveys that sought to bring together stakeholder opinion. But that said, I do think that that was really important because it was an avenue for individuals to make their views known in a way they could not possibly have done if the only way you could make your view known was to come to New York. I mean, there are people around the world who have no possibility of coming to New York, who are not members in some of the major NGOs or international civil society organizations. And unfortunately, I think it's very, very difficult for the UN to give equal voice to every stakeholder organization. It's very difficult. And so you find an unfortunate situation where some who are present here tend to be the ones who get listened to. And they are not necessarily representative of every organization out there. So in a sense, that kind of inclusive, social media-driven type of survey is critically important because it gives voice to those who would not otherwise be heard.
Can you describe at least 2 examples of programs and or policies designed to foster social inclusion and participation?
Well, I mean, we in UNEP, we have a what we call the inclusive green economy, which is a concept that's pretty wide-reaching. It's a way of bringing together a resource-efficient, low-carbon economic activity or model of economic activity that allows for environmental sustainability, but also tries to work with social inclusion. And one of the aspects of that we look at very carefully is the question of employment and what kind of green employment or sustainable employment we can put out there. Now, part of the examination that we've done for the inclusive green economy is to look at what kinds of activities, what kinds of new sectors can contribute to this kind of inclusive, green, sustainable economic performance. And we have found there that in many respects a lot of the, how should I put it, a lot of the work that goes on in things like providing payment for ecosystem services, which would be something that's not usually done in the context of regular economic policy, is a way of bringing into, let's say, the bigger picture, people who are otherwise marginalized, who provide necessary services but don't get remunerated for them. And this kind of inclusive activity cannot usually be managed or organized from a government sitting in the capital and issuing ministerial decrees. This is something that you have to get out into the ground, out into the rural areas where the people actually are, and try to get them involved, try to get them to understand that the services that they are providing in the course of their day-to-day activities are valuable and should be remunerated, and we are about to set in place a system that will allow them to be paid for what they're doing on our collective behalf. That works best when the reaching out to these individuals, to these groups, is done through the new means of social media, where we can get activists to go out, get people who are in the area to go out and speak to those who we're trying to reach in a way that we couldn't reach them otherwise. We find also that there's a lot of use of mobile telephony, mobile telephones in particular, to collect data that can be used to influence policy. And nowhere is that more evident than in the agricultural area, where we have farmers using social media platforms to communicate information about soil conditions, weather conditions, the stock of seeds, storage facilities and so on, so that policymakers who are quite distant from where the problems are actually happening can find out about these things in almost real time, react quickly, and send the right kind of solutions back down to the ground. And I think that is another example of the kind of work that social media, social inclusion can actually facilitate.
Thank you. So, can you describe at least 2 cases where inclusion and participation were decisive in the designing inclusive and successful public policies?
I can think of one that is a very powerful example. It's not in the social field, but in many respects it has social implications. I think of mobile banking in parts of Eastern Africa, in particular in Kenya, where this was something totally unanticipated by the authorities, if you will, by the monetary authorities, the central bank that's in charge of the banking system. It was an initiative that came out of the availability of mobile telephones and the recognition that a lot of people who had access to telephones could use those telephones to do their banking in a way that they would not have been able to do if they had to go into a physical bank. Physical banks just not being out in the villages or out in the rural areas. And the initial design of the system that allowed them to use their mobile phones to access their bank accounts or to set up bank accounts and then access them, that was a design that proved not to be entirely suitable to the situation. And the people who were setting that up, the individuals who were designing these new mobile apps, if you will, to be used on cellular telephones, they went out and they did a lot of field research, and they asked the people who were piloting the project for them, who were the test candidates for this use, what was working, what wasn't working. Part of the problem was, for example, that they knew they didn't have a lot of bandwidth, and so whatever solution they put into the app had to be very, very light, because it couldn't depend on a lot of data transmission. And they made changes that made it possible for the average user in rural areas, using a relatively simple cell phone, to transact the core business, the things that they needed to transact. And that reaching out and hearing the views of those who were the participants in the project and those who would ultimately benefit from the project, and using those results and those opinions to improve the product, and then launching it again, and the constant iteration between those who were providing the service and those who were using the service, has led to a situation where mobile banking now in parts of Kenya is world class. You find it's better, it's the way in which banking is done, and it has led to a degree of financial inclusion that far outstrips anything that the big international financial institutions were able to achieve through the best designed programs for small and medium enterprise financial inclusion and banking and small scale retail financial inclusion. A simple thing like an app and a cell phone was able to overcome a problem that had been causing difficulties and hindering development for 30 years.
Wow, that's a powerful example. Would you know of another example more pertinent to public policy, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I would consider that monetary policy is very highly public. But again, another example, I think, is when you look at the use of, again, mobile telephones to convey data to institutions like the World Food Programme, the World Health Organization. And they use this kind of decentralized, if you will, almost privatized monitoring, the flow of information coming in, to understand, for example, how good is the food and nutrition security situation in distant, remote parts of a country. They will find it easier to react quickly to any sort of shortcoming that they can find if the information is flowing in real time by cellular telephone. And they've set up telephone numbers that identified individuals in these communities can call on a daily basis to say, yes, the feeding of the infants has gone well, or no, we're having a little bit of problems in making sure that all of the the children that are at risk are getting a square meal 3 times a day. And this allows them in the World Food Programme and in IFAD, as well as in the World Health Organization, not only to target specific communities for intervention so that they can make sure things don't slip too far out of hand, but also to understand better how the interventions that they provide and the food that is being fed, for example, to threatened children in these areas, corresponds to a certain nutrition profile. And they are able to adapt their own interventions as a public policy type of approach to react to any deficiencies that they are noticing from the data that they're collecting in a very decentralized manner. Now, what that means is that the citizens living in these communities are themselves contributing to improving the quality of the intervention that these international agencies and the government agencies that are working with them are able to provide. So what you find happening is a constant adjustment and refinement of the policy intervention in a way that allows the best possible result to come out, because you're monitoring the results on an ongoing basis by the people who are the beneficiaries of the policy.
Taking into account the lessons of the post-2015 design process, can you name at least 3 recommendations to foster inclusion and participation in specific terms around the implementation of the post-2015 agenda and the SDGs?
I think the first recommendation is to understand that the SDGs are so complex that no one actor is going to be able to deliver everything. So it can be the UNEP. The state will not be able to do everything on its own. Everything has to go through partnerships. So the first recommendation would be to assist, and anybody who's a stakeholder should think seriously about how he, she, or that institution can contribute to building up the kinds of partnerships that we need for implementation. Because the partnerships very often will have to go across individual sectoral lines, it'll have to be multidisciplinary, looking at different things at the same time. That's the first point. The second point is, I think, clearly, because we have so many different actors involved in delivering the implementation of each individual SDG and the SDGs as a whole, I think there needs to be a very clear sense of who is supposed to deliver what. Because not everybody will be able to contribute the same thing or in the same way. But the partnership depends on everyone, every part of the partnership delivering what is expected at the right time. And I think it's really important for us to understand that the kinds of partnerships we've dealt with in the past, very often between the government and some partner, it might be an official partner, it might be a non-official partner, that those were simpler times and we were dealing with simpler issues. And now we have more complex and more complicated matters to deal with. And so consequently it's really important for us all to understand and agree as to who will be doing what and contributing how to these partnerships. I think the third thing to keep in mind is that, and I think this is a real departure from what it was before, is that this is really a universal agenda, and everyone is affected by it in some way, and everyone can contribute to it in some way. We should not expect that the flow of information or the flow of resources will be in one direction. It can very well be that a smaller developing country has a particularly positive experience in one aspect of the social dimension of sustainability, or in one aspect of environmental protection, and that these are lessons that could be learned elsewhere in the system, within that country or across its borders. And I think it's going to be really important for us to keep track of what has worked well, what hasn't worked well, and why, and to communicate that, to make sure that as many people as possible know what has been working well for us and why, and to share that experience so that others don't have to reinvent the wheel but can learn from our mistakes and our successes and accelerate implementation in their part of the world or in their specific area. And I think that mutual learning and that mutual support will end up being the one factor that makes the biggest difference in terms of implementation. A last point I want to point out is that we need to step away from the thinking that this is a government agenda. It really isn't. Governments can set the framework, they can set the policies, and they can build partnerships and encourage implementation, but they won't be able to do it on their own. And it means that a lot of us who previously have sat back and waited for policy to be done on our behalf are going to have to go out there and implement policy ourselves. I think that's key. I think we have to understand that this is really something that empowers us all to take charge, to participate, and as a community then, to say this is important and we're going to do it together, and we will be able to make progress in areas that previously might have been too much for any one of us to handle on our own.
Thank you very much, Elliot, for participating in this fantastic interview. The content of the interview will be a part of a qualitative analysis that includes other 19 respondents from various institutions and representing diverse actors in the international community. But your input from within the system and your valuable approach to some of the solutions are very well taken. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.